Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie Couch with Emma Bridgewater. Emma founded Emma Bridgewater, the modern pottery brand, in 1985. Her hugely popular pottery is all handmade in Stoke-on-Trent using traditional techniques. This year, she designed a special edition Marie Curie daffodil polka-dot mug, where £5 from the sale of each mug sold goes to Marie Curie. Emma was awarded a CBE for services to industry in 2013. She has 4 children and currently lives in Norfolk. I'll be talking to Emma today via video call. Emma Bridgewater, welcome to the Marie Curie Couch. Can I begin today by asking if you can tell us about a significant death you've experienced in your life?
There have been quite a few. As a family, we've had some sort of rather turbulent times. But I think I'd like to focus on the death of my aunt, my mother's younger sister, which happened 3 years ago. She was tremendously important to me. I feel I've explored my mother's death very extensively in that she was extremely ill for 22 years before she died, and somehow I'd sort of processed that a lot. Whereas her younger sister, who mattered tremendously to me, I felt it might be interesting to tell you a little bit about her.
Was your aunt ill for a long time? Or
No, the thing is, whereas my mum had an accident when she was younger than I am now, in her early 50s, and then was ill for 22 years, was very damaged by that accident. Her sister was killed in an accident, aged 70, and we all had every reason to believe that she'd still be with us for decades at that point. We're quite a long-lived family, rather frighteningly long-lived. One of my great aunts made 103, nearly 104, and my granny was 90. So there was a terrible feeling, terrible with Tisa, that having lost mum, she would go on forever. I was really banking on her. I have banked on her all my life. She's been a huge support. And the shock of that was a very, very, very different experience. Much harder to grieve, much harder than an anticipated death, someone who goes through whether it's a long illness or in my mother's case, a sort of long deterioration.
what happened to your aunt?
There was an accident out of doors on a moor in Scotland, and the vehicle that she was in overturned. You hear about those accidents and you pray it doesn't happen to anyone and suddenly it's her, and it's the worst nightmare.
How did you first hear about the accident?
My brother rang me, and he's a very gentle, sweet person, and he was tremendously cut up, but he was very, very kind of sweet and gentle. And then there was a sort of welter of calls. My aunt has 2 sons. I spoke to them, and as a family, we cleave together very strongly and kind of support each other. And my sisters and I spoke about it a great deal. So we kind of do verbalize it, grief. We go to each other with our grief very readily.
I was just thinking about that, whether we have any sort of advance warning about someone's death or not. And a lot of the work we do is to try and support people to plan for the end. So whether that's practical things like, having a will in place, or talking to people about their funeral wishes, whether they want to be buried or cremated, and I think when it's a sudden death, it makes potential for, the sort of aftermath to be potentially more complicated than it might be if somebody's had time to plan, or a family have had time to plan.
And indeed, in this case, there had been there have been no plans whatsoever.
Of course.
But the thing that intrigues me thinking about her is that hers was a life lived in a very contained, I mean, she was the most generous, outgoing person, but it was really exemplary. It's really interesting how clean and simple it was, how few complications she'd left. And it's had a big effect on me, and that knowledge that you've got to tidy your affairs up, whether it's the practical things like a will. Now, her husband is a solicitor, and there's no question of her not having a will. And all that kind of thing was, the sort of practicalities in her case were always very straightforward. So really what we had to do was to deal with our grief and our feelings about her. And we did that sort of very much together, an awful lot of physical contact. When I think about having to deal with death during the pandemic, that you might not be able to be with your family and people you love, I find that very, very difficult. It really breaks my heart to think of people dealing with death alone, because I know that we got through this tremendous shock with no plans in place, simply by being together and talking it through. And whilst we'd never talked about her death, she was, just as Mum had sort of demystified childbirth, because she was keen on quite sort of fast and furious riding. She had a lot of horses. We'd all talked both humorously and seriously about the dangers and how it could happen. And so though hers wasn't horse related, somehow it was in character. There was preparation in the way she'd lived her life, in the way she talked about her life. And her immediate family, her husband and widower and her sons, knew exactly what to do. There was a small church service for immediate family, and then an enormous outdoor event. It was in October, and it was a miraculous golden afternoon after the church service. And we built a huge bonfire, and hundreds of people arrived, and people on ponies and horses, and lots of all-terrain vehicles. It was an incredible coming together of just a small fraction of the people who'd adored her. And it somehow had, her character led us towards it. So, as I say, it's made me feel really on my mettle. I think we should all prepare for it. We should all talk about what we feel about death and how we would like to be remembered. And although she hadn't explicitly done any of that with a view to her imminent death, somehow she'd laid a lot of clues and left things in a very orderly way, practically and emotionally. And an enormous number of loving family and friends who sort of instinctively knew what to do in her case.
So she was preparing, even though you might not have necessarily been directly discussing it and talking about it.
It feels to me like she lived a really good life. She lived her life well. Her emotional affairs were in very good order. She was never scrapping with anybody. And if she, I can't really think of her. I think of her laughing, absolutely marvelous laugh, and other people laughing with her. It just, her life and death exemplify for me the need for an ever-growing awareness of how you are in the world. And somehow she passed through all of our lives like this terrific comet. She was energy and fun and drama. And whilst, her exit was dramatic, and the get together with this huge bonfire and the gorgeous autumn afternoon was beautiful and dramatic, her exit was as clean as could be. There was very little ragged left over. There's tremendous sadness, but not the trouble that comes in after some deaths.
Can I ask, Emma, was death and dying something that was openly spoke about when you were younger, in your family and as a family? Was it something that you talked about, or was it something that wasn't discussed?
It definitely wasn't sort of a forbidden subject. And whether it was, burying various pets, from small sort of mice and guinea pigs to the sort of bigger tragedies of a dog much loved, or a pony having to be dispatched. The cliche about sort of exploring that subject first through household pets is a good, strong one. Because I know that as a child, that was where a lot of those conversations started. But if I tell you that my mum's and Teresa, the aunt I was speaking of, their father was a clergyman, and he didn't die. I mean, I was 18 or 19 when he died, so I remember him well. And he was an extremely serious and learned man. But there just wasn't any embarrassment about death. I guess, it was quite workaday for him. There's something about an accustomedness, which is, sounds like an odd thing I'm about to say. There's something to me quite enviable about somebody who gets to kind of live with these big issues. I think they grow, and they're sort of, I think, tackling the huge business of death blind, as it were, with no practice, not having talked about it. It's unthinkable to me, and you need the help and guidance of well, because of my grandfather, I would turn instinctively to the clergy. I know several priests who I would often ask for life advice, but knowing that they're in matters of bereavement, they're the ones with the expertise, like, people such as yourself. And I think one of the things I've learned in my business life is, for heaven's sake, stop and ask the way, as it were. Ask for advice. Don't just drive around in circles, getting lost and feeling, sadder and more confused. I always liken the business of asking for advice as driving when you're lost. My husband and I always, and ex-husband, we also watched about it, he would hate to stop and ask, whereas I would immediately stop and ask as soon as I saw someone who looked as if they might know the way. And in marital driving rows, as in the rest of life, I think ask for help. Find somebody. For me, the instinct is to seek someone out who can help you. And I think the fact that people are now really able to reach out for grief counselling, for professional help, is tremendous. That's such a civilized development.
You touched on earlier, Emma, about how there was a difference in your experience of grief after your aunt's death because of obviously the traumatic sudden nature of it. Are you able to talk a bit about what some of those differences were?
Between my aunt's death
and your mum's?
Yes. Mum had a dramatic accident on a horse. So we all knew that she'd been doing something she loved. And the accident came on her very suddenly. And she then had this extraordinary, they expected her to die and she didn't. So there were terrific traumas, and she was in intensive care for a month, and then she was in a coma for another 2 months. Towards the end of that, she regained consciousness, and the extent of the damage was very complex because she was physically much less damaged than they assumed while she was in a coma. They'd sort of thought she would probably be more impaired in motor terms, but she was absolutely fit as a fiddle, and climbing through windows and starting cars and letting the sheep out and trying to live her old life. So she was discharged very quickly, sent home. My little sisters were the only people who were there all the time. While we sorted help out, they had the alarming job of looking after her, and we put support in around her. But it was the beginning of 22 years of tremendously testing and sad times, in which I know that I grieved her very fully. And friends said, "Oh no, you won't have done. When she dies, it'll release a whole lot more sadness." But actually, in those 22 years, I worked through my feelings about her, and for better or for worse, my life sort of geographically has meant that I've spent a lot of time in the car, on my own, routinely driving about 60,000 miles a year. And I used that time not just to shout at Radio 4 and learn a lot of country songs, but also I thought about my mum. I played songs that I knew she loved over and over. Sometimes I think I would do that to trigger thinking about her on purpose, in order to to remember what she'd been. One of the difficult things through that long period of, she was speechless. She was utterly confused. She never spoke again. So I felt a great need to hold her very carefully in my mind as who she'd been and what we'd lost, to respect what, that it was ghastly for each of us, but I quite quickly came to see it was worse for her, that what she was going through was a terrible, terrible thing. And then I got to a place of understanding that it wasn't a life of no value. I'd sort of felt, just as she'd always said, you wouldn't put a horse or a dog through pain. I couldn't bear that we had to watch her in this very kind of incredibly reduced and sometimes very unhappy state. And then I came to see that she was often happy in rather different terms. If I snuck into the last nursing home, if she didn't see me coming, I would sometimes find her in the middle of a sing-song. I mean, she wasn't really, actually, she could sing sometimes, but she'd look quite happy. And I learnt to know that sometimes, perhaps particularly when her guilt-inducing family weren't around, I think she wasn't always unhappy. And somewhere along the way, I started to let her go, to let her leave. And when she died, I was just tremendously happy and relieved. I felt it absolutely clearly as a release for her. And there was no sorrow after. I mean, the sorrow had all been, I sort of quite conscious, and sometimes mostly unconsciously, but sometimes I'd consciously, as I say, triggered myself to kind of keep on that journey of really thinking about her. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it does. And I'm just really struck by you describing your time in the car. And that was not out of choice, as you say, it was kind of part of your life in driving a lot of miles. But what I heard there was taking the time to reflect on and think and almost be quite proactive about, putting the song on to get the memory, to work through the process.
Yes. I always worry about the word work for this kind of psychological kind of exploration and development, but actually that's what it is. It is quite hard work. I mean, it makes you sad. I mean, I wept buckets for her. There's so much grief, but I find it very, very, very helpful to be on my own in the car, not upsetting anyone. I didn't want I wanted my children to know how sad I was, but they didn't need to see the extent of it. And I felt that much as I resented the mileage and it really exhausted me, I did know it had been a very fortunate thing that I had been able to put it to very good use. And I would often drive in silence or seek out very different music to kind of, again, just triggering, pushing on, trying to make it progressive, my feelings about her. And about life, in amongst that, obviously, I was thinking about the rest of my family and my work and my marriage and our friends. She'd been a great life enhancing figure. And whether I was, actually, I don't know if it exactly relates to this, but what I came to realize that she, after Mum died, that she'd just become a part of me, or I had become a part of her. And there wasn't much difference really between me, her mother. And one of my younger sisters died of cancer last Christmas. And I sometimes feel quite confused about where the boundaries are between us all. Because particularly I live in North Norfolk, in a place that was familiar to my mum in her childhood and her mum. And, I remember Nell, my younger sister, playing here, romping in the mud as a child. So all the same places, all the same picnic ingredients, the things that Granny taught Mum taught me, that I did with Nell, that I'm doing with my kids, it all becomes kind of this very lovely kind of continuum. So place has really helped me, I think. If I'm doing the things that Mum taught me, or if I'm doing things that her sister, my aunt, taught me, they're so close to me. I find that very, very, very comforting.
The coronavirus pandemic has triggered a wave of bereavement across the country and taken away our ability to be with loved ones and grieve in traditional ways. Marie Curie's new Memory Cloud is an online space to reflect on a loved one's life and share special memories with your friends and family. Visit memorycloud.org.uk.
So moving on a bit, you have your children and your own family. Would you say that you talk to them about death and dying? Is it something that's sort of open in your house?
I really want to say yes, but I really want to make sure that it's true. But for my children, I don't know whether we've been very unlucky, but between them, they've lost, I think, 5 close friends. I've got 4 children. And some of those were sort of friends of the family, friends of all of the children. So I think, I really hope we have talked properly and openly. And there have been some extraordinary commemorative events. And I think of some of the services for those kids and how much you can do in your sort of communal grieving. That the sharing is so important. But actually, with one of my children recently, we were walking up the Thames, doing a bit of the Upper Thames that I know very well. And she said, I'm really struggling with the death of one particular very close friend of hers, which was a long time ago now. It's 5.5 years ago, maybe 6. And she said, it's still so raw and vivid to me. How do I move on with it? How do you deal? Where is your mum? Where's Teaser? We're talking about other people who died because mum's 2 closest friends died just after her. And we were walking towards Kelmscote, which is William Morris's house, a place that I was taught by mum to love very much. Not that I went there with her, but William Morris was one of the household gods. His taste, his energy, his extraordinary sort of multi-talented life had always interested her, and so she passed that on. And I've since been there a lot, and I really love it. And I said to Kit, as we walked along the path upstream towards it, I have a strangely powerful sort of image thing that I use, the imaging that I learnt. Actually, when I was preparing for her birth, marvellous midwife taught me that very good trick of turn the contraction into something extreme and positive. So I turned it into surfing. And I said, I have a sort of imaging thing that I do when I'm sad about mum, or Cant, or T, or the many people we've lost recently.
Mm-hmm.
I develop a magical power, and I can swim upstream like a very, very sort of powerful mermaid. And we all love swimming in the Thames, particularly. But you show us any lake or river or beach, we'll all be charging down towards it. And that was mum, and that was Teaser, who kind of imbued all that. And I said, I swim to Kelmscote. And then I'm no longer a mermaid because I can walk around and it's dusk. It's quite difficult to talk about. And they're all inside there. And they're having a really lovely time. And I can hear them. And I can smell what mum's cooking for supper. And it's going to be great in there. And I kind of have a really balanced thing about whether I'm glad not to be in there or actually would quite like to be in there. And that mirrors a thing that sometimes with mum, when I was doing the horses on a winter evening, she loved, and the yard was just it's like 30 yards or so from the house. And she said, I love the view of my house at night lit up and everyone in there. So that image of a warm, safe place, lit and glowing and candles and fires. And that really helps me. And I do that often if I'm in trouble about grief.
Well, that sounds like an incredibly open conversation you had with your daughter on that walk. So I think, and also the fact that she's able to talk with you and tell you that, yeah, even though it's 5.5 years ago, it's still raw and it's still painful. And, what can I do, mum? And,
Yeah.
you can talk about what helps you, in your grief, or what helps you when you're struggling. And I think that visualization sounds very beautiful, but I know that can be incredibly helpful as well, can't it? It's sort of, when you started to describe it, I thought, you were going to talk about taking yourself off somewhere else, but actually I was moved by the fact that they were all there at the end of it.
Yeah, that's the good bit.
Yeah, that's the good bit.
I am going to see them all again.
Yeah, which is really lovely. Can I ask, Emma, do you think about your own death?
No, I don't. But as I said, I think it was particularly my aunt's death that made me know you've got to start weaving in the loose ends now. Just, don't leave a mess. Don't be at odds. You've got to try and I feel on my mettle to make a good death, to prepare. Well, I'm not saying I'm preparing. I'm saying at the moment it's sort of the outside of that. It's trying to make sure that I'm not making a muddle. I'm not going to, as far as possible, I'm trying to see my way to leaving things in an orderly state, both the practical things and the emotional things.
Does that mean that you've had conversations about your wishes with your family, about your end of life wishes or wishes after you've died?
Not really. I mean, we've had rather an appalling lot of practice, and we've organised some extraordinary funerals and memorial services and parties and get-togethers as a clan. And I got to the place of thinking that belongs to who's left behind. I can completely entrust myself to them if I've got it right in life. Because after all, I won't be there. I'll be whooping it up in in Kelmscott with the others. Is sort of what I feel, that I will be. My feelings about it are by then irrelevant. I hope they'll feel empowered by me to make their own decisions about what they need. And sometimes a very, very big thing is called for. My sister Nell's death was a huge, huge, huge event. Even while she was in hospital, many, many, many people came through that ward to say goodbye to her while she was dying, and that went on for a whole week, over a whole weekend. And her funeral was, I don't know how many people were there, 1,500 or something like that. I mean, it was huge. It was in a cathedral. That was necessary for her, whereas sometimes something much simpler. My grandmother's funeral in a church that I can see from the window here was just very, very, very simple. And a huge skein of geese flew over as we were standing around the grave. And it just felt like it was done. It was all finished very well. So sometimes just like I think weddings have got a bit out of hand, I think funerals could get out of hand. We don't all need a great big send-off. But neither do we need to say, I won't have a big send-off. I think it's up to my kids and whoever the key people are in my life at the time that I die. I think it's up to them. I feel that part of that preparation is knowing that I absolutely trust them, and that it's what they need to know. They've already found out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think, as I said earlier, part of the premise of the podcast is to encourage people to have conversations about death and dying. And in those conversations, people are going to have them, we'd encourage people to have them with their own family and
definitely,
friends.
definitely.
And I think some of the practical things, like we touched on earlier, like, writing a will, or funeral wishes are of course important, and it's good to get them written down and have those things documented if that's important to you, but also what care people want as well when they're dying. So where they might wish to die, whether that be in a hospice or at home, or and for some people it's not important, but for some people it is. And I was struck by your mum, 22 years of her life, and how she was she'd ended up in a place in her life where she was less able or maybe even unable to express her wishes, just on a daily basis. And I was just thinking about people who might be listening, who's caring for someone right now, who might be living with a chronic long-term terminal illness, who's less able to express what they want and what's important to them and what matters to them. And how do we have those conversations before we end up in that situation? How do we plan for that?
Well, if we just set COVID aside for a moment, what occurs to me as you paint that picture is that we could well do with any version that works of waking the person after their death, because it perhaps it's in the swapping stories. So just say someone eventually dies after a long illness, very tired, and the care is played out and not sort of perhaps lost track of what the person was before that terrible illness. There's a huge joy in being together, whether virtually or, I think it would be something to really struggle to achieve, so that you can share stories about that person. And I think in those stories, you'll find clues to how to properly see them off if they haven't left you a sort of an order of service. And I have to say, a close friend of Mum's did plan her service. She was having a terrible time dying of cancer, and with a lovely priest who is exactly one of the people I was thinking about when I mentioned earlier how important professionals can be with your great experience. And it was very necessary for her. And her family said, that it gave her great courage and comfort. But actually, there was her hand was so strong on the service, and for various good reasons, it was several months after her death. I found it quite difficult, actually. It was almost too intense. That possibly my instinct to sort of maybe give yourself over to your family and friends. It was beautiful. Everything all her arrangements were wonderful, but there was something quite spooky about it as well, about her hand in every detail of the service.
It's really interesting. Is legacy something that's important to you? In legacy, as in how you'd like to be remembered or how you will be remembered?
I don't think it's up to me. I really don't. And I'm bothered by people curating their legacy. I think it leads to HS2. I think the idea that you should, try and control what you're remembered as and for is desperate, really, really desperate. And I feel sorry when people start a charity. I can see how that work and memorializing can be really, really good. But for me, I think you've got to be careful about the levels of distraction that you give yourself. And I would definitely encourage people to donate, perfectly speaking, to Marie Curie. So often your best help in those desperate dog days. I think sometimes people cut themselves an enormous great task to distract from grief, whereas it might be better to sit with the grief and to encourage, to raise money for an existing charity. I'm not quite sure why I feel that, but I know I do. I suppose it is slightly anti the legacy idea. I think sinking down into the turf is what you do then. Whether you're buried or cremated or whatever. I don't think you matter when you're gone. And I think, well, my grandmother had this thing that she didn't want a gravestone because she felt that they were melancholy. And the churchyard here were very keen that people would know where her grave was. And so the compromise I came up with was a flat stone, sort of, proud from the ground. And I thought, for as long as perhaps, my daughters and their children or whatever are visiting, they can sort of scrape the grass will start to grow over it. They can scrape it back. And then when it's forgotten, when she hasn't got any visitors, it can quietly sink down. And that I feel that straining for immortality means nothing to me. But then I'm the person who's put my name on a lot of cups, some of which, as we know, pottery shards might last a long time. So perhaps I'm talking complete nonsense. But the idea of trying to guide what people think about me after I'm dead. I really don't know.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that, how long pottery lasts. The little shards.
Yeah, it's a thought, isn't it? So there you go. I'll be remembered as a fragment of spotty pottery.
Just before we finish off, Emma, can I ask what it's meant for you to be able to share your story with Marie Curie today?
Well, it's a privilege to have been asked. And exactly like you, I feel keen to encourage people to talk with their friends, with their family, about their feelings about death, whether it's the death of somebody precious who's just died or what might happen after one's own death. I think talk about it, folks. We should all be able to talk more readily about death, bereavement, terminal illness. Otherwise, suddenly in the great sort of sadness and drama of someone's death, you've got to learn the vocabulary all in a rush. And if there is a barrier, if you do feel shy about it, work to break it down. Better to start processing. It's better to start thinking and let what can happen. I think through talking about it, through processing grief, it's possible to find if I think of my daughter and I walking along the Thames, she's still so sad about a death 5 years before. Whereas more recent, my sister's more recent death, I felt I could feel myself processing because of having that imaging. So you want to get from the deep, deep, dark misery to some kind of joyful connection with what that person really was. So the loss starts to just meld into the joy of that life, because it's so awful to live sad. And I think talking about grief can help convert that heart-rending trouble and sadness into a gentle kind of real available joy about the person instead. And achieving that for my aunt and my mum, and I mean, I'm still working on it with my sister. It's very raw, but it feels so worthwhile.
I like that. Emma Bridgewater, thank you so much for joining me today on the Marie Curie Couch and telling your stories and being so open and honest with us today.
Jason, thank you for asking me.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, you can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. This podcast is made by Marie Curie, a national charity that supports people affected by terminal illness. For more information and support, you can visit our website mariecurie.org.uk. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Sound and Vision. The music featured is Time Lapse by Panoceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.